Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Hawley, and excited that you're all here. I'm thrilled that we have with us today Robert Bonney, who's talk on the role of agriculture in a clean energy future. Robert is the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation at USDA. This is his second stint at USDA, about to finish up your 12th year, I think. Yep. Previously, he served as Undersecretary of Natural Resources and the Environment and as Senior Advisor to the Secretary when Secretary Belfer, who I think is in his 12th year now.
He's a retread too?
Yeah. So you guys have been working together a long time. But Robert worked throughout the 8 years of the Obama administration in those roles and is back now throughout the first term of the Biden administration. Prior to his return to USDA, Robert taught and researched natural resource policy at Duke University. He's also worked with the Bipartisan Policy Center to establish the Farm and Forest Carbon Solutions Initiative. Bonnie has degrees in forestry and environmental management. We have an environmental management degree together. Class of 95? Class of 94? Yeah. It's hard. He grew up on a farm in Kentucky, but has to die. And now lives in Loudoun County, Virginia with his wife. Robert, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Good to be with all of you. I'll start with a story about Joe, which is Joe was working in the Obama administration. We were both in Copenhagen, and he had done all this work to set aside $1 billion to address tropical deforestation. Remember this? And my boss, the Secretary of Agriculture, for those of you who don't know, the U.S. Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture, was in Copenhagen, so he's the guy that's going to make the announcement. But I can't remember why you were working with OMB or something. I couldn't remember, but we weren't sure we were going to be able to announce the $1 billion. So we were literally 10 minutes before the event that Vilsack is going to make this announcement. We had 2 speeches written. One with the $1 billion and one without the $1 billion. Well, we got the call, like, right as we walking in, boss, take one speech and the other. $1 billion.
Because we worked a little too late.
Yes.
That's why you're now.
Yes, Office of Management, but important people in our lives. So I'm going to talk to you about climate smart agriculture, maybe a little bit of dusting forestry thrown in as well. But I want to tell you a little bit about my job. So my job oversees 3 public-facing agencies. So I'm the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation. One agency is the Farm Service Agency. We do farm loans, we do disaster payments, all dairy programs. It's the sort of most important farm agency. Deals with farmers and ranchers all the time. Oversee the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is the largest source of discretionary conservation dollars in the federal budget. Most people don't think about conservation, don't think about USDA. A lot of the resources for conservation are actually at the Department of Agriculture, and most of those go through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I also oversee the Risk Management Agency, crop insurance. So the most important risk management tool that farmers use. And so most of the time I'm not talking to places like Harvard. I'm talking to places like the Iowa Farm Bureau or corn growers or others. So good to be with all of you all. And I spend a lot of time these days talking about climate smart agriculture and forestry and talking a lot to farmers about that. And the conversation has changed dramatically since Joe and I worked together for the Obama administration. Beginning of the Obama administration, we tried to pass cap and trade legislation, which included provisions for farming, ranching, and agriculture. And in the beginning of that conversation, agriculture was at the table, interested but nervous. And as we got towards the end of 2009, agriculture ran the other way. concerned about what climate policy is going to look like. It's going to be top-down, regulatory heavy, which is going to be done to us, not with us. And for the remainder of the Obama administration, agriculture, going to talk to agricultural groups, part of my job, to go talk to them about climate, hard conversation, difficult conversation. A lot of funny looks from folks in the countryside. Today, that conversation has changed dramatically. So in early August, I was at Farm Fest out in Redwood County, Minnesota. Anybody else at Farm Fest? Redwood County? And I had a meeting with the Minnesota corn growers. Walk in, what do they want to talk about? They want to talk about carbon intensity scores. Top of their list. Here's what we're doing to get our carbon intensity scores for our corn and soybeans down. And we want to work with USDA to figure out how we can push down those scores. This is not just Minnesota. There are lots of places where agriculture is very much engaged at the table as we think about climate smart agriculture and forestry. So why the change in attitude? What's happened since the Obama years to today? Part of it, yeah, probably some of it is we're seeing more disasters, we're seeing more extreme weather events, we're seeing more impacts. Probably starting to be a growing consensus in the countryside. This climate thing actually might be for real. That's part of it, and I actually don't think it's the biggest part of it. I think a big part of it is markets are changing. There's starting to be value in the marketplace for commodities that are produced using sustainable practices, climate smart practices, and other things. And so they're starting to hear from that. They're starting to hear from the Pepsis and the Walmarts and others that there's potential interest. A lot of interest right now in biofuels and the potential to push down the carbon footprint of biofuels. That's driving a lot of interest too. So starting to be some appreciation in the countryside that there may be opportunities here. And I would say another piece is policy has changed. Again, cap and trade, and I worked at Environmental Defense Fund, the biggest proponent in the NGO community of cap and trade programs. But if you're a farmer in Iowa, cap and trade maybe appears like it was written in San Francisco or New York City, and maybe wasn't written with you in mind. And that was the concern from the countryside. And today, policy looks a lot different. It's sort of this weird, it's this weird sort of situation where there's much more public investment and interest in policy to address climate change, including to encourage climate smart agriculture. But a decade, 15 years ago, we were all operating on the assumption it was going to be cap and trade. We were going to be in a cap and trade world. For agriculture, that meant we were going to trade carbon, we were going to finance this through this thing in carbon markets. And today, while the public interest in climate policy has moved dramatically, the types of policies that agriculture is looking at has opened up dramatically. It's not just cap and trade. Yeah, carbon markets might be part of it, but they might get value for low carbon biofuels. Or there might be value in the marketplace for climate smart rice or sustainably grown milk products. And so while climate policy has advanced some ways in really important ways in terms of agriculture, it's actually opened up. And that's created opportunities for agriculture to think about how do they shape the policy agenda in ways that actually work for them. I could spend a lot of time today talking about resilience, adaptation, disasters, all the extreme weather events that we're dealing with in agriculture and forestry right now. And we spend a lot of time on these issues now, a lot of times. Crop insurance, disaster payments, post-fire restoration. But I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. I'm really going to focus today on mitigation and the role of agriculture in climate mitigation. We all know, many of you know better than me, if you want to figure out how to get to net zero by 2050, agriculture has to be part of the conversation. Forestry has to be part of the conversation. Of course, internationally, the two are linked. We need to grow more stuff on the existing acres so we can take pressure off of tropical forests. But it's really hard to get the math right unless you figure out how to work with farmers, ranchers, and forest owners globally and in the U.S. In the U.S., agriculture accounts for about 10 or 11% of our emissions. Half of that is in methane, about half of that is in nitrous oxide, so emissions from fertilizer use, methane emissions from livestock. Interesting thing about both agriculture, and I should say, forestry is a net sink, about the same amount. So in the U.S., even with all the fires, even with all the disturbance you see out west from fires, beetles, bugs, all that stuff, our forests are a substantial net sink. About 20% of that is in wood products, right? So big sink, opportunities to do more to increase that sink. But in agriculture, like forestry, we could do a lot both to not only reduce emissions, but to sequester carbon in soils. I worked in environmental policy for a long time. I started out trying to figure out how do you get private landowners to manage their lands in the ways that will produce endangered species. And if you know anything about the Endangered Species Act, a little bit controversial, kind of like climate policy, right? And when I started, we were in the wake of the Spotted Owl. Many of you weren't around when the spotted owl was a thing, but highly controversial. And for a lot of private landowners who brought property rights to the forefront, how are we going to manage for these owls when they cost millions of dollars in foregone timber revenues per breeding pair? So really contentious issues around those issues. And on the one side, significant costs for wildlife conservation. On the other side, the interest in keeping landowners on the land, continue to manage profitably, and that created conflict. And you saw that in the Sagebrush Rebellion in the 1980s. You saw it in when the Republicans took over Congress in 1994, and the pressure it put on environmental policy, and we've seen it since. Issues around those have been highly polarized for a long time. Interesting thing about climate when it comes to agriculture is that there's actually a lot of alignment. So if I take an agricultural operation, corn and soybeans, and I put in a cover crop, that is, I have a cover crop during the winter time, and in the spring I terminate the cover crop, plant corn, or plant soybeans. Turns out that I'm going to increase the productivity of my soils. I'm going to increase the ability of those soils to hold water. They're going to be more resilient in the face of extreme weather events, whether heavy rains or drought. And if you look across agriculture, there are all kinds of areas where there's an alignment, where things are actually good for the climate. The cover crop stores more carbon in the soil, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere. Conservation tillage, where I use fewer tillage passes in my operation, same thing, store more carbon in the soil, take carbon out of the atmosphere. Nutrient management, if I use nitrogen better, not only does it benefit my bottom line because I pay less money for nitrogen, turns out to reduce nitrous oxide, very powerful greenhouse gas. If I can figure out ways to capture methane, I can turn it into energy through a methane digester, and I can sell that. I can power my milk trucks off of it, as some dairies do, or I can sell it into the grid. Forests. In the West, there's a little fire problem out there. What do we need to do? We've taken fire out of those ecosystems for 120 years. We need to do forest restoration. We take small diameter trees out of many of those forests, and we need to turn them into wood products. Again, there are markets for that. So there's this alignment. There's this opportunity to do good for forestry, do good for agriculture, and do good for climate. I would say you don't always see that in environmental issues. And I think that's part of this dynamic why you've seen the conversation change as well. So there's alignment. It doesn't mean that there's a skepticism out in the countryside. It doesn't mean that when we still go to talk about climate smart agriculture or forestry, people look at us a little funny in some parts of the country, concerned that climate policy may be overbearing, it may be regulatory heavy. They may have costs associated with it, or may be inflexible. So I spent between the Obama administration and the Duke and the Biden administration, I spent time at Duke, at the Duke administration. And I thought government bureaucracy was something that you guys put us to shame. When I was there, I did a project to look at rural attitudes on the environment. I was interested in looking at how rural voters and urban voters viewed environmental policy differently. Turns out there's no difference in how much people care about the environment. Rural folks care just as much about the environment as urban folks. The difference isn't in the what we believe, it's in the how. How do we do environmental policy, right? The minute you start talking about the federal government, or you start talking about the policy mechanisms related to what you do about the environment, rural voters are more likely to be skeptical. If you ask them about climate in particular, you can guess their answers on whether they believe climate change is real based on what they think about the government and the federal government's role in all kinds of policy, but environmental policy, right? So there's skepticism in the countryside about what people think about environmental policy. It's also important for all of us that care about environmental policy to recognize that there are actually a lot of limitations to a regulatory approach. I mentioned I worked on endangered species conservation. Endangered species are rare because they don't have enough habitat. If you want to put the habitat back, you actually need people to go out and do things. They need to plant trees, they need to get rid of invasive species, they need to reintroduce fire, all these things. You can regulate anybody into doing that. You can't regulate into people doing good things, right? See, regulation is good at stopping bad things, not really good at getting people to do the types of things you want them to do. And if you think about climate smart agriculture and forestry, that's the thing we're trying to get. We're trying to figure out how do we get people to adopt certain practices as part of their operation so that they improve the climate. And so a purely regulatory approach isn't going to work very well for getting climate smart agriculture and forestry out in the countryside. When I first came into USDA, I led the transition team for the Biden administration at USDA. I then switched over to deputy chief of staff for policy because it takes a little time to get a Senate confirmed position. It takes a little bit of time. So I was waiting for this position. I was in the secretary's office. I said to the staff that we're going to work on environmental policy, I said, you all are going to get really, really tired of me saying voluntary, incentive-based, market-oriented, collaborative. Because every time we talk about climate smart agriculture and forestry, that's not what we're going to talk about. Approach matters. The how matters. We're going to get this done in a way that works with farmers, not against them, with ranchers, with forest owners. Now the trick is there has to be accountability, right? So we have to measure, we have to monitor, we have to have accountability mechanisms to make sure we get real gains. And so this approach of a voluntary incentive-based approach, but accountability is what we're focused on. There's another piece about agriculture that's really, really important. We have to feed a growing world. We have to clothe a growing world on a shrinking land base. Shrinking because of development in agricultural land, shrinking because of desertification, shrinking because of climate change. So we have to get more productive, not less productive. So even while we think about how do we reduce the impacts of agriculture on the environment, we have to think about how do we actually produce more. That means technology, innovation, genetics. All those things are really, really important as we think about how to solve this problem. We have to have more technology, more innovation, more precision agriculture, right? And even while we reduce the impacts. So let me turn to policy now. I want to talk about a few things we've done on policy, and I want to open it up to all of you. So our flagship at USDA, kind of our flagship climate effort is something called Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. When we first got to USDA, we decided, you know what, we should actually do a lot of interaction in agriculture. We should public comment, we should do requests for information, which we did. We had this idea of using something called the Commodity Credit Corporation. Commodity Credit Corporation is a $30 billion bank that USDA has to support agriculture, right? And what we wanted to do is not create a conservation program, but actually create a commodity program. A commodity program that created incentives for folks to produce commodities using climate smart practices. So the idea is we're going to set aside a certain amount of money in this fund. We're going to pay projects that go out there, work with farmers to implement climate smart practices. But When they do that, we want to measure, monitor, report, and verify. We want to make sure that we understand what's happening on the ground. So as they're out there implementing practices, we want to have a system in place to understand what are the impacts on the environment. We also want to make sure that this program is available to everyone. If you know anything about USDA, you know we have a history of discrimination. So everything we do, equity matters. We have to make sure we serve everybody. Small, medium, historically underserved, tribal. Every project in this partnership for Climate Smart Commodity has to have an equity plan. The last thing is we want to create value in the marketplace. We want to look for opportunities to harvest value for the marketplace for commodities that are produced using climate smart practices. We initially set aside $1 billion in the Commodity Credit Corporation. We put out an RFP, we got $20 billion. All over the country, every crop, forest, range, land, livestock, you name it. We went back to L&D. Hey guys, $20 billion, right? So we now have $3 billion committed to 135 projects nationwide. We've been in implementation phase for about 18 months, a year for some projects, 18 months for others. We're close to 4 million acres. We have 13,000 farms enrolled. And there are some folks that are leading projects that you'll recognize, Danone, Archer Daniels, Midland. There are other places where we're working with tribes, or we're working with the Tennessee Farm Bureau. They're conservation groups, the Nature Conservancy is leading a project, they're commodity groups. Iowa Soybean Association has a great project, not only in Iowa, but in a lot of other states. And we're starting to see some value in the marketplace. If you ever eat Blue Diamond almonds, we have a great project with Blue Diamond. They talk about starting to see some value in the marketplace for sustainable practices. So more to come. As I say, these are, we're early on in implementation. These are designed to be 5-year products, but the idea here is to de-risk a large-scale adoption of climate smart practices so that we can work to look at ways that we can find value in the marketplace. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we got $19.5 billion for climate smart practices for USDA. These are existing conservation programs. Some of it is for a program called the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. Jim, you asked earlier, the Conservation Reserve Program is the largest commodity program. I think ECA now surpasses it. We'll get $8.5 billion through the Inflation Reduction Act through the program, and so spread that over 5 years. The program is already at about $1.3 billion, $1.4 billion annually. If you can do a practice on private lands that benefits the environment, we can probably fund it through the Environmental Quality Center. Right? So we do a lot of things. In my part of the world, at Chesapeake Bay. We're doing wonderful stuff on the Connecticut River. Here, the Connecticut River that runs through Massachusetts down to Connecticut. We're doing great stuff. We're using conservation easements. We're improving farm practices. We're improving forestry practices. So these IRA dollars went into the existing programs. Environmental Quality Incentive Program, our conservation easements, conservation stewardship program, which also pays to deploy practices on private lands. And then something called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program is a little bit like our partnerships with Climate Smart Commodities. Groups of farmers, groups of conservation groups can come forward, propose a project about how they're going to deploy those resources. We put out an RFP in the spring for $1.5 billion through that program. We got $5.3 billion in proposals. All of which is to say there is a lot of demand out in the countryside for these types of practices, from farmers, from ranchers, from forest owners, right? And so again, the conversation we were having 15 years ago, the world has changed. There's a ton of demand out there. Some of you all may know that my life is dictated to a large part by something called the Farm Bill, which gets reauthorized every 5 years. There's a big debate right now on the Farm Bill about how we're going to pay for some additional dollars needed for the commodity program. And that debate started about a year and a half ago. There were a lot of folks that thought, hey, we're going to look at those conservation dollars. We're going to pay for commodity programs using those conservation dollars. So it's really important that we demonstrate at USDA and in NRCS that we can get those dollars out. And we have. So we got basically 100% of our IRA, our new funding out. So we're doing a really good job of getting it out there. We're doing streamlining our partnerships. Because we've been able to deploy those resources, nobody now is looking at those resources in the context of Farm Bill and thinking that's how we're going to pay for other things in the Farm Bill. So we've made significant progress there. Still have yet to figure out how we're going to write a Farm Bill, but I suspect that waits until after the election. Part of the IRA resources as well was a $300 million investment in measurement, monitoring, reporting, verification. So as part of that, we're setting up sites all over the country, 5,000 sites, to do a better job of monitoring soil carbon. We're going to do better science around methane, better science around nitrous oxide emissions. We're improving the modeling, both the modeling that we have for producers to allow them to make decisions about what practices they put on the ground, and we're doing a better job of the inventory numbers and the modeling up that we give to EPA and others that shows what USDA agriculture is doing. So big investment in MMRV. We're spending a lot of time these days as well on sustainable aviation fuels. When I went to talk to those Minnesota corn growers, one of the things that was driving them was their interest in feeding into those markets. And so corn growers, soybean growers, very interested in ways that they can reduce the carbon footprint of their commodities, because they think, and rightfully so, they think they're going to be markets both in the sustainable aviation fuel and other biofuel markets. And so, again, a lot of interest in market opportunities there. We're also beginning to pivot a little bit. So people ask me what I'm doing at USDA right now. I'm like, I've got 4 months left. I'm a political appointee. Don't know what's going to happen after November, right? It's all about execution for us, right? Execute. Partnerships for Climate Smart Compliance, execute. Inflation Reduction Act, execute. The one place we're actually potentially making some new policy is around markets. And the potential for USDA to begin to step in and begin to maybe guide a little bit some of the protocols, carbon protocols that we use to measure carbon, to measure the carbon intensity of biofuels. We have a law passed called the Growing Climate Solutions Act that we're now implementing. It asks us to look at those various protocols. We are not anticipating that USDA is going to create its own USDA. We have an organic, you go to the store, buy organics, it'll have a USDA organic label. Probably not going to have one of those. Certainly, definitely not going to have one of those in the short term for climate smart agriculture. There are a lot of things short of that we could do, right? There's data we could provide. There are other things we could do to help the market standardize some of the standards around what is a carbon ton, how do you measure soil carbon, all those types of things. So you're starting to see USDA pivot into some of that work through both the Growing Climate Solutions Act, but also our work around sustainable aviation fuel. We put out an RFI, calls for information, sorry for the government speak there. We opened up public comment on creating a process to standardize how you track carbon intensity scores, how you measure them, how you track them through the supply chain for biofuels. So we're doing a lot of work that have broader implications on how do we find value in the marketplace for U.S. agriculture. At the end of the day, I think these markets will be important. I think incentives will be important. I think our commodity programs may slowly adapt over time through crop insurance, farm loans, and other things to create value for those producers that use these climate smart practices by essentially reducing their risk. Shouldn't you get a lower interest rate on your loan if you're using practices that reduce the risk to your operation with crop insurance? When they create policies, they create an advantage for producers that actually use things that will reduce their risk. So at the end of the day, I think we get to scale by having a number of tools that farmers and ranchers can choose from as they implement their operation. I'll conclude with one thought, which is one of the things we try to do in all of this is play the long game. By the long game, I mean, at the end of the day, we need support in agriculture, in forestry, if we're going to be successful. Folks are going to have to choose to adopt these practices. We're also going to need we're going to need the public to understand that there are actually real gains here. There are real gains to the climate, and we can continue to support agriculture in a meaningful way. And we need political support. if you've looked at the red-blue map of the United States, you know that rural, where a lot of our forests and ag lands are, pretty red. And so it is vitally important that we create bipartisan support for what it is we're doing. The long game. People are used to the pendulum swinging in Washington, from one administration to the next. In this issue, that does not serve us well. Polarization is the enemy. We have to figure out how to build a system that has agricultural buy-in, that has public buy-in, that has bipartisan support, that provides us the resources to be able to get this done. I think we've made a good start of that. At the end of the day, we're going to have to prove that this works. So we continue the last 4 months of where I know I'll be working at USDA to focus on execution, to focus on our efforts to get this stuff out into the field. So hopefully in the long term, the public sees, Capitol Hill sees, and others, that agriculture can not only continue to feed the world, we can do it in a more sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Let me ask the first question, and then you can call on whoever raises the hand. As a reminder to everyone, questions are a sentence that ends with a question. Having said that, I'm going to make a couple statements first. If we look back at sort of the long history of USDA, there was a point in time when it was I believe, had a representative in every county in America, the extension agents, who would reach out to farmers and foresters and help them think through what are some of the best practices for our local environment. Quite a robust research network with ag experiment stations as well, and some of the research about the growth of corn and hybrid corn reflects this kind of back and forth between USDA and the research, with practice, learning what works, what doesn't, to then inform subsequent work. Is there something like this now where we think about these sort of new or evolving methods to be climate smart, where there's some subsidies and some programs to get these farmers to just try something, but then how do we learn and then amplify the lessons from that experience to other farmers?
It's a great question. So we actually have offices, NRCS and Farm Service Agency have offices in we have 2,352 offices across the country. We have pretty good coverage. That said, even with that, even with almost an office in every county, there is no way we get to scale on this stuff unless we figure out how to, universities, extension, crop consultants, ag retailers. So there's ag retailers, folks that sell you your chemical, your fertilizer, your seed, right? So value in that marketplace is actually really important too. If you get a draw for sustainable aviation fuel, you'll get a draw for low carbon corn and soybeans, and you'll get a draw for pivot bio or other nitrogen products that actually reduce nitrous oxide emissions, or cereal rye as a cover crop, right? And so part of it is how do we actually bring the agribusiness, those folks inside the tent with us. Your point about research is really, really important, and we have undervalued research, and USDA is a big research arm. We have the Ag Research Service, we have the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, we have the Economic Research Service. Forest Service is a huge research side. NRCS has a research side. Even so, a lot of that research wasn't thinking about climate 10 years ago. More of it is thinking that way now, but there's more to do there. And that's a place where I think increasing the connections to universities are really, really important. We were talking about sustainable aviation fuels earlier this morning. We're working very closely with Colorado State, Michigan State, a bunch of other universities to help get the math right as we think about carbon intensity. So it's also part of the reasons we think about all this stuff. This collaborative effort's really important. So we've got 51 universities, I think, in the partnerships with Climate Smart Commodities projects. There are a bunch of universities actually in those projects. And we're going to need more of that. And particularly is put scrutiny on how we measure this stuff, how we measure it cost effectively, how we model it. So huge issues there, great question. And frankly, more to do. Yeah.
Following on that note of research, where do you see the role of innovation being in the space? Like, more so on kind of like technology and potential like new ways to add to the value chain. How do you even like select what is really important when there's like so many things coming out? Like you mentioned so many ways that we can like harvest methane or like create outside of just like innovating in the traditional seed and fields, like those like new innovations, like how do you index on those?
It's a great question, and frankly, we struggle with it. If you think of what we fund at USDA, we fundamentally fund practices. By that, I mean if you sign up for an environmental quality incentive program payment or a conservation stewardship program, we're typically funding you implementing certain practices on your property. The problem is, to your point, there's a ton of innovations. How do we keep up with that? How do we make sure maybe take a little risk on new technologies? So give you an example. In last summer, we started having conversations with the dairy industry about new feed additive. It was in process with FDA. This additive we think reduces methane emissions by 30%. It's significant, right, for dairy cattle. We changed our practice standard to allow it so that we could fund it. We approved $90 million worth of grants to fund implementation of this, because we think in the early years it's probably more expensive. If you're a producer, you're like, do I really want to do this? Like, what's going to happen? You know, my cow's going to be okay. So we need to de-risk it. FDA approved it this past spring. Those programs are, those projects are now being implemented. There's a ton more out there. A bunch of our projects for partnerships for climate smart commodities have new measurement technologies. A company called Yardstick or Optics. There are a bunch of new technologies out there for measuring this stuff. And so again, like that doesn't, that doesn't always fit into what we're used to funding. And a standard is when you're dealing with a big organization. NRCS has 11,000 employees. Standardization matters a little bit. You want to make sure that people are funding typical stuff out of the countryside. At the same time, there's just innovation. And so we're struggling. Struggling is the wrong word. We're trying to figure out how to adapt to this and take some risks. If you're a government employee, sometimes you're a little bit risk averse because you don't want to end up on the front page of the New York Times for funding something you shouldn't have funded, right? And so we as leaders in the agency have to think, hey, we've got to actually get on the front foot. We've got to lean into this, and we have to be taking some risks. And there's enhanced soil weathering. I mentioned new measurement technology. There's a ton of innovation around nitrous oxide and seed coatings that will make their own nitrogen. And so this is a critical area. And we've got to maintain agricultural productivity. We have to produce more with less impact, and there's no way we do that without technology. Yeah.
You started your talk by talking about the development of the cap and trade system. What ongoing relevance do you think carbon markets can have in driving down emissions in the agricultural industry?
Carbon markets are going to be important. There's no question. They're going to be part of the toolbox. If you look at California and some on the land sector, particularly on the forestry sector, a little bit on the agricultural sector, some of our projects that came into the partnerships with Climate Smart Commodities thought about carbon markets and are now probably doing both carbon markets and kind of serving companies that want green supply chains, all those types of things. Part of the problem in carbon markets has been high measurement costs, high costs associated with soil carbon or others, greenhouse gases. And so we both have to reduce the costs of measuring those, but frankly, at the same time, there's skepticism out there. There have been a lot of carbon projects that haven't been great, right? You all have read the same things I have. And so it's this classic thing where we have to create something that's cost effective at the same time that we increase public support for this. So I think carbon markets aren't going to be the thing, they're going to be one thing. And they're going to be one thing that hopefully is something that farmers, ranchers, forest owners can take advantage of. 15 years ago, we thought it was the thing. And I think now we think it's part of the portfolio. It may be important in some areas, methane emissions. Dairies are going to be able to sell methane reductions all day, easy to measure, harder in other areas, and so it's got to be part of the portfolio, it's not the only. Yeah.
I've got some background in conservation easement, and I'm interested in how forestry is grouped under agriculture in your context. Can you talk a little bit about how your approach will differ when you're approaching a forest manager versus like a farmer, and if that group is subject to the same sort of political swings and like hesitancy as a farmer would be?
So on the political side, I'm a forester by training. I've done a lot of work with foresters, forest industry, and others. Politically, the same as agriculture. Rural tends to lean right. Interestingly, the forest industry is really interested in better measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. So they've come to us wanting better numbers because they think there's value in the marketplace. So the politics have changed there too. On the conservation easements, the U.S. Forest Service has a program called Forest Legacy, which purchases conservation easements on working lands. So we have programs that have been primarily targeted to farmers and ranchers. Agricultural conservation easement program has a piece of it that's dedicated to wetlands. Some of that goes into forest, and a piece that's more dedicated to farmland, ranchland. That'll get forestry as somebody's got a 40-acre woodlot or otherwise. If there's a gap in our forest easement program, it's that. We actually need more opportunity to work with smaller landowners that either don't have wetlands or it's not a piece of a woodlot, it's a piece of a broader tract. There's a group of folks, Nature Conservancy, American Forest Foundation, a lot of others who are actually working to sort of expand our authority. It's not a decision we can make administratively, we need help from Congress. The U.S. carbon sink is incredibly important. It reduces our greenhouse gas emissions annually about 11 to 12%. That has amazing value. We ought to be investing more in keeping those forests intact. I would say part of that is going to be markets. Markets for wood products. Pulpwood markets are not great. And if you want to keep people in forests, we need to make forests actually pay. It's a combination of incentives, it's a combination of easements. Markets matter too. So.
If you ask climate advocates in blue state America what kind of agriculture they want, I think many of them now would say regenerative agriculture. It was interesting to me that you never mentioned that label. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard Secretary Vilsack use that label in public. Now, there'd be a good reason for that. There's no agreed definition for regenerative agriculture, but there's also no agreed definition for climate smart agriculture. So there might be another reason. It could be, and this is a reason I would endorse, a wise, prudent desire not to wave a red flag in front of red state America.
It's not quite that stark. At the end of the Obama administration, we were working with the government of the Netherlands, Vietnam, and others on an effort to create a global alliance on climate-smart agriculture. And as part of that, we adopted the term climate-smart because it was neutral. Exactly the reason you point out. It didn't have baggage associated with it. Regenerative has some baggage. Organic has, for some people in agriculture, some baggage. It's also different than thinking purely on the climate side. So part of the choice for climate smart is actually it didn't have a lot of baggage, and that it was pretty neutral. And in all this work, we've tried to build it in a way that agriculture sees themselves in it, that it makes sense to them. And so the terminology was important there. And because climate smart was kind of new, it allowed folks not only in agriculture but outside of agriculture to define it. And I think that's been useful.
You talked a lot about OMB, and I'm
I
curious.
love them dearly. You get that on record?
Into mine. Can you speak to how like the institutional practices of benefit cost analyses, risk assessment have allowed you guys to enact some of these policy priorities or incentive programs that you have?
So, when you're going to expend any significant amount of money on anything, OMB is always going to have some oversight to make sure the agencies are both abiding by administration policies and statutes and other things. So, in the Inflation Reduction Act, they've run a pretty intensive program to make sure we're on target to actually move resources, but also make sure, like, do you have a good process in place for choosing which practices? How are you doing that? How are you relating to farmers, ranchers, what's going on? And that's actually been really, really helpful. So in the implementation of IRA, it's almost weekly meetings. With OMB, other parts of the White House, here's how we're implementing, and that's not just true in USDA, it's true across the board. Using the Commodity Credit Corporation in the way we did for partnerships for climate smart commodities was new. We knew it was a different thing coming in, and we knew we'd have to have a conversation with them about that. We began that conversation during the transition and continued it until we announced it in September of the first year, just announced the idea, which we then took a public comment on. And so OMB is like any constituent. We want to make sure that we're transparent with them, that we take their input, and we change things as a result. And so we did that with partnerships for climate smart commodities. It benefited from their scrutiny and insight. And so, there are some things that are smaller decisions, maybe a practice standard for methane emissions or something, which don't rise to the level of going to OMB. Big funding issues, big policy issues are always going to go up there. And we need to, they're our colleagues, and we need to work with them like we work with the constituent groups.
So you've talked about many of your examples of where there's appetite for climate smart solutions, including CI scores, are in energy-related areas, either biofuels or methane digesters and that sort of thing. When you get into crops, whether it's wheat or cotton or something like that, those markets already exist for the energy ones. The low carbon fuel standard in California is really driving a lot of that appetite. When you get out of that, you just don't have those market incentives in place that you measure CI scores, give you funds for using a low CI crop. So what do you see as the medium run to longer term sorts of developments that need to happen to provide equivalently strong market incentives outside of the current energy crops?
Pepsi is involved in the Iowa Soybean Association project, and they are interested in reducing the carbon footprint of their supply chain. So all these companies out there that you've seen make commitments to net zero by some commitment, many of them have agriculture in their supply chain, and that is driving quite a lot of interest. You have companies like Land O'Lakes, which has Truterra, Danone, both of those have climate smart grants. I mentioned Archer Daniels Midland for ADM. Part of it is biofuels. Part of it is they see a customer base that's actually asking them questions about the carbon intensity of the commodities that they're producing. Early days, right? And we're still figuring this stuff out. But there's starting to be value, either access to markets or perhaps a premium. One of our climate smart projects is marketing buy off the shelf, climate smart rice. The deputy announced this project. Agriculture has rice is produced in Arkansas, it's milled in Wisconsin. The secretary got himself, he went to Wisconsin for the announcement, got himself a 2-pound bag of rice, which is the best traveled bag of rice. Any bag of rice he takes with him. Pulls out his climate smart bag of rice. I mentioned Blue Diamond. I mentioned that there are dairies starting to see, and a lot of it is driven by the Nestle's, the Mars, the other consumer-facing companies that are kind of looking at these issues and starting to see some, we think, value in the marketplace. But you're right, though, biofuels, in part because it's connected to demand driven by EPA policy as well as 40B and 45Z, the sustainable aviation fuel incentives in the tax code. That's pretty immediate. And folks are still figuring out, how are they going to source those commodities, and that's, I think, creating real value in the short term.
Building on that question a little bit, how is the Climate Commodity Program thinking about valuation of non-carbon and non-greenhouse gas emission benefits, both in which projects you're choosing to fund, but then also this medium to long-term strategy where the markets may not exist for biodiversity, increasing products, and that sort of thing?
That's a great question, and so we did not, in designing partnerships for climate smart commodities, we didn't say, hey, we'd love if you go out and protect some great Kentucky woodpeckers, go towards bog turtles. On the other hand, those practices, our IRA incentives as well are tied to kind of existing practices. And you don't have to worry about us going out and waxing habitat. There's not going to be a trade-off in that way. But there are going to be projects where we are intensively managing lands for agriculture. We have some great livestock projects where you might get a sage-grouse, or you might get a lesser prairie chicken or other, where you're going to get water quality benefits. And I think, generally speaking, from a water quality standpoint, very comfortable that we're going to produce significant benefits. We did not require anybody to measure and monitor those things. I mentioned the Blue Diamond Project. The Blue Diamond Project is finding value in the marketplace not from selling low-carbon almonds, but from selling biodiversity benefits associated with hedgerows, pollinators, cover crops. It's really about pollinators. And so there may be places where we create markets that actually aren't climate markets, they're related, and we're helping subsidize them. There's a broader issue of making sure we actually measure and monitor those services. We didn't require projects and partnerships to do that. We have a pretty good sense of that when we implement IRA projects. But there's a whole lot of research that could be done about valuing that. That we've done. ERS, Economic Research Service, does some really good work in USDA, but frankly, there's more work to be done.
I think a lot of previous principles that govern agriculture, focusing on innovation technology, overuse of fertilizer, yield, have led to quite a few poor climate impacts. So I guess, to what extent are those values being questioned in current conversations about agriculture and changing climate?
It's a great question, and it comes up sometimes in the innovation context. So when you think about innovation, new practices, are there impacts that we need to think about? We're dealing with a lot of PFAS on agricultural land. Nothing to do with anything we've been talking about today. But that was an innovation. Hey, we'll take this sludge, great fertilizers. Yeah, go talk to farmers in Maine right now about PFAS. Huge challenge. We try and do some analysis of the new practices and new innovation that we're doing all the time to try and capture that. But my answer earlier, there is some risk. As we think about new innovations, there's always some risk. I think for us to mitigate that, if there's really stuff that's kind of pretty far out there, think about how we pilot it. How do we try it in a small place? How do we do measurement, monitoring, reporting, verification in a smaller setting? We have a program called Conservation Innovation Grants that takes a portion of our environmental carbon incentive programs and uses it to do stuff like this. If we're smart about how we use it, we'll anticipate the type of things you're talking about, and hopefully catch it before it becomes a product.
Arguably, the transportation industry also accounts for a huge part of the emissions. Are there any incentives to produce locally and seasonally rather than globally? Is there a marketplace for the local and seasonal?
There's a much bigger question about what USDA chooses to subsidize in commodities and agricultural policy. And if you look back 15, 20 years, cotton, rice, soybean, peanuts, corn, right? There's a small number of crops. So part of the evolution you've seen at USDA, and particularly, I think we've accelerated it, is particularly in crop insurance. We should provide crop insurance for all of agriculture. Right? Everybody should have. You shouldn't be making decisions about what you plant based on the crop insurance product you get. We've done a ton in livestock. We do a lot of crop insurance now for livestock. You think about that. Insurance for livestock. But if you care about grassland birds, you care about rangelands, right? Maintaining rangelands. Actually, having products for livestock are probably a pretty useful thing. A lot of our smaller producers and diverse producers actually have livestock. Young producers, they come in a lot of time with livestock. So diversifying the options we have for all of agriculture, particularly fruits and vegetables, right? The small producers that provide food locally, often fruits and vegetables. So lots more insurance products there. The challenge is they tend to grow a lot of different crops at once. So we have a new crop insurance, actually not that new, but we made some changes to it called Whole Farm. For the farmer, you can come in and produce, get an insurance policy for your whole operation. So we will get at transportation by having a subsidy system which provides opportunities for those local producers. We'll also get at it because we actually provide, through different parts of USDA, a lot of value-added grants. So we provide funding to folks to try and create value-added products in the supply chain. I was up in Massachusetts in Western Mass at an apple farm. Guy sells cider, he sells apples locally, sells apples to school, peaches, other things. Those are the type of things we support businesses like that. We're not directly dealing with the transportation stuff, but we're probably supporting more local agriculture. So we try and do a lot to sort of invest in local food systems. Our nutrition programs, we create opportunities for SNAP to buy local produce and other things. So there are efforts there, again, not directly at the transportation side, but if we create opportunities for farmers there, then we deal with some of the transportation emissions. When I came in the Obama administration, there was a little bit of people conventional on one side, and organic and everybody else on the other side. And the truth is, like, we've got to serve everybody. And these folks actually do better when there are insurance products, risk management tools that actually serve all of agriculture. It actually creates people who are like, yeah, we get it. We need crop insurance for everybody, and it benefits them as well. I think there's less polarization between those different parts of agriculture now, but making sure we serve all agriculture is really important.
Thank you very much.
I loved you all.
I'm curious how much conviction you have in a green agreement for the consumer side. I imagine that when you survey people and ask them how much money they want to pay for a crop or a commodity,
They look at different when I shop at the grocery store.
Exactly. So it's a matter of, some Whole Foods customers are willing to pay 5% more, and that's probably not enough to make the economics of that market work. So how do you think about that, and how much the industry?
It's a great question, and it is a really important question. And I think there will be value in the marketplace in some places. I know there will be value in the marketplace on the biofuel side. And I know there will be access to markets in the breeding supply chain. There may be some opportunities on carbon markets that will create a value. But I don't for a second think that the market is going to solve this problem in and of itself. I think we're going to have to have a bundle of incentives. There's going to be market incentives. I think as we think about finance, crop insurance, how do we support agriculture, because there's actually a bunch of, Lily gets to this question, there's a bunch of stuff there that will matter. I think there will be a need for a long time to come for conservation incentives, for us to de-risk conservation activities, to work directly with farmers, ranchers, protect those systems. I think we will need to continue to invest in better measurement tools to lower the costs of sustainability and all that stuff. And I think all of that together gets you to scale. But I don't for a second think that markets in and of themselves will get it. I will say this. There's a lot of opinions about profit sharing and subsidies and all those things. When you talk to folks in agriculture, they want value in the marketplace. And if you can get them value in the marketplace, they will manage towards that. And there is a ton of interest in that, in agriculture and in forestry.
Considering the necessity of irrigation in agriculture, just be a little bit about the overall irrigation policies and how you ensure that we're able to provide for the future.
Another great question. And irrigation is, people think of irrigation as using almost everything. We irrigate our cattle. We love the cattle. Give them the cattle, right? So irrigation is critically important. In parts of the West, you all know the story of Cadillac Desert and how water has moved around the West. We tend to, the USDA, not to deal directly with that. We do a lot of projects to improve water use efficiency, so we'll support efforts to do that. So we do a lot of sort of smaller scale stuff on water. So a lot of, this environmental quality incentive program and a lot of those dollars will go to help improve water use efficiency. This is another area where where we produce and what we produce matters. So in the Ogallala Aquifer, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, there's a lot more sorghum production now. Why? Because water is less water intensive. So you will see some changes in agriculture around water availability. We're already seeing it. And as we think about long-term about how we deploy our resources on the conservation side, these issues related to water are critically important. The Department of Interior has the Bureau of Reclamation, then the Army Corps, DOD, who are more directly involved in how do we move big water projects, big dams, and all this stuff. Our engagement is really about at the producer level, how we work with farmers to reduce water. Critical issues, another place where technology and innovation are critical. There's a ton of new technologies in irrigation can dramatically reduce the amount of water used to grow a certain amount of commodity. You'll see a ton more innovation there as well. Yeah.
Can you talk about how risks of wildfires are currently being conceived in Valley forests? Because on one hand, the forest can be great assets for preservation. On the other hand, they can be completely flipped in the case of a wildfire. And given climate change, it's just an interesting irony to consider. So is there any active consideration of including wildfire risks in Valley forests as a situation?
Yeah, I spent, so during the Obama administration, I was over the Forest Service. Spent an enormous amount of time on wildfire, and that agency is spending an enormous amount of money fighting wildfire. And the work on the front end to do the restoration is critical to reduce the probability. That's another place where wood markets are going to matter a lot. If you think about the costs of large-scale forest restoration in the West, it's not billions, it's tens to hundreds of billions. There are places where, because of lack of markets or just because of the state of the forest, it costs us up to $6,000 an acre to do restoration. We probably have 78 million acres that we need to restore. So these are big costs. We're starting to run into it even on our side, not just the Forest Service, on our side of the shop because of the impacts on cattle producers, the impacts on water, right? So you get, after a wildfire, you get huge flushes of water. The ecosystems don't hold as much water. So it's creating huge challenges for us. And you, the taxpayer, spending, what do we spend? Just a USDA $3 billion a year fighting wildfire. And we're going to continue to spend that and more as we go forward. Investments in restoration, investments in prescribed fire. Native Americans were burning those forests for eons. We need to go back to that. And but the problem is the expense of getting there is substantial. We have a couple of our climate smart commodity projects are looking for innovative uses of small diameter wood. Critically important, and there's a bunch of technology and innovation there as well. Huge challenge, and if you look at the threat to the U.S. forest sink, it is loss of forest in the east to houses and urban development. It's losses in the forest. And when I say losses, we're going to burn them down, and they ain't coming back. We're going to transition to grassland because of climate change and other factors, because we burn those forests so high. And you notice I don't use the word climate crisis. And I don't use it because it's a little bit, it doesn't actually play that well in the world, so I stay away from it. There's a forest crisis, and probably an undervalued forest crisis, particularly in the West right now. And it's big and expensive, and it's going to take a lot of resources to solve.
We have time for one more question. Where are you guys out? All right.
Thank you. I have a question relating to balancing of different concerns. Also, you have climate and environmental on one side, but also there are recommendations to increase vegetables and fruit consumption and decrease sugar consumption and so on. And the corn, for instance, is very low or very highly subsidized in the United States. And I wonder, does the dietary recommendations and so on inform the policy? Would you say that?
I'm not in the business in USDA of dietary guidelines as it comes to kind of sustainability and those types of issues. Folks want to make choices, great. Our job is to do as much as we can to provide the tools that we can to get U.S. agriculture and forestry to adopt those practices. Think about meat consumption, right? What I've argued to you is that we have to do this in a way that brings agriculture along for the ride. Livestock is, a bunch of the corn, soybeans, other products we produce is for livestock production as well. So, from USDA's standpoint, we want to be equitable to all of agriculture. We'll get a question over here to make sure we solve all of agriculture. And let consumers and others make decisions about diets and otherwise. Both because that's something about the toolbox we have, but also because we're going to do this with all of agriculture, and we need to bring all of agriculture with us. And so we'll leave the dietary questions to others.
So before we wrap up, let me know if we'll meet again at noon next Monday. We'll be in Rubin starting 4:14. Michael Stevens, who's a visiting researcher at the Belfer Center, will present on pricing rules for electricity auctions with non-convexities. A little different than today's talk. But I had a really fascinating conversation with Nicholas just last week, so it'd be great if you could join us for that. Finally, please join me. And thank you, Robert Bonney, for his presentation.
I think it's anything on non